All right, this is a brief overview of women in the American Revolution from 1750 to 1810. The extent at which the American Revolution was actually revolutionary or radical has been up for debate amongst historians for a long time. So, the extent at which the revolution impacts women's lives is also something that women's historians have debated for a long time. We know that women developed a new political consciousness. We know that it led to greater educational opportunities and public presence for women, but the extent at which this influenced significant change is something that historians tend to um, disagree about. So you'll have to decide for yourselves. Women's participation in the war began really before the fighting ever started, right? During the fight with Parliament over taxation issues. Um, One of the very first boycotts was over, you know, British made goods with the Townshend Act. And a group of women started local chapters of what was called Liberty's Daughters, groups that encouraged women to not only boycott British made items and imported goods from Britain, but also to start making their own items at home to help replace the items that would have normally been imported. So women start spinning their own yarn, they start making their own clothes, they start making their own shoes and really encouraging the development of a more domestic economy, a greater domestic industrial economy, so to speak. And for women who were doing this, it was called homespun virtue, right? They were thought of as virtuous women because they were helping to support these boycotts and helping to support this political cause. Now, women also are involved in a lot of the conversations about whether, the colonists should indeed start a new nation. Should they rebel? Should they, launch this revolution against the British government? And this is a politicizing experience because women have opinions about it, and sometimes they disagree with their husbands. And, I think there's a common myth that these women were uninterested in politics. They didn't care to listen in when the men were having their political conversations, but the reality was they were much more aware and cognizant than the men knew, and they were um, really starting to develop their own sort of political consciousness. In their actual involvement in the war, you can draw on a multiple um, different examples from traditional work as camp followers, taking over businesses, farms while their husbands, sons, brothers were away, um, you know, having these new opportunities to really work in traditional men's roles because so many men were off fighting in the actual American Revolution um, versus the more non-traditional roles, that women were, serving as nurses, as scouts, as spies, as soldiers, in the example of Deborah Sampson. So very, very much a politicizing experience for them also when it came to their involvement during the war years itself. Women come out of their, after the war is over, women really have had a changed, their lives are changed because of their involvement. They feel empowered because of their contributions. And I think this is a new um, era for women going forward, that they're starting to see themselves as more vital to the national makeup, to the new nation, than they had seen before. For African American women, they also have some opportunities, particularly in Lord Dunmore's proclamation for the British government that, any African Americans who could flee to the British side, they would be offered freedom after the war was over. That led to some enslaved blacks receiving their freedom with the British um, military after fighting. But that was really not an option for a lot of African Americans who were not close to the fighting, or especially for women who would have had to risk taking their children and leaving their families. Um, so the real opportunity lay in really the rhetoric of liberty, that as liberty was on the tongues of everyone, North and South, many slaves used petitions and used this the American Revolution uh, to their advantage. That if we are going to be fighting against Britain for our freedom, because that was the analogy that a lot of the colonists made that they were slaves to Britain. Well, the slaves said, "Well, if you're trying to fight for your freedom, we need our freedom here. If we're going to be a nation of free men, then we cannot have slavery." So they used that rhetoric of freedom and liberty to their advantage, and many successfully petitioned to get their freedom. Many were manumitted and sought their kind of new lives as free people that way. For Native American women, because most Native tribes supported the British side, they thought they would have better chance keeping their land in the British hands, who were trying to, um, limit the expansion of the colonists. Um, they thought they would have a better chance at siding with the British, but most were under pressure to assimilate to traditional European gender roles, and there's a loss of some of the traditional roles that women played um, in tribal society. So, overview, opportunities that come about from the revolution. The Second Great Awakening leads to greater egalitarian and greater um, e- opportunities for women to serve in the church, to serve as in benevolent societies, to really get involved in more community building efforts. Another opportunity that comes about from the American Revolution would be um, the evolution of Republican motherhood, the idea that women needed to rear good citizens, bring up, educated children, so that the nation would have responsible Republican, men essentially. And if they were going to do that, well, then they would need to be educated themselves. So we see a real surge in education amongst white middle class and upper class families. And this obviously is going to lead to just greater self awareness through their own education. And it's also going to lead to greater career opportunities, because we see women mainly being um, the educators, as teachers. They can go on to be administrators and um, those kinds of things. Companionate marriage would also be another area where we see some opportunities for women after the American Revolution. Um, More women and men were allowed to choose their partners. Family authority in some ways became less patriarchal and more egalitarian. We actually see more people marrying for love. Um, and that is an interesting kind of consequence or impact that the American Revolution has. This idea of freedom and independence in some ways also applied to the decline in arranged marriages. Um, Civic responsibility kind of is attached to the Republican motherhood idea, that women now have a greater kind of role in developing the new nation, in again rearing and educating, and therefore it gives them a greater opportunity, more leverage to have power over the home and things that relate to the private domestic sphere. Another opportunity comes from the fact that slavery gets abolished in the North in the Revolutionary years and immediate years that follow. So many um, former enslaved Black women, have their freedom and have um, the ability to grow a family outside of slavery. For limitations, legal inequalities persist. We still see the femme covert and coverture at play. Women do not become full-fledged citizens. They still do not have voting rights in the aftermath of the revolution. Slavery persists in the South. We see some manumissions in the upper Chesapeake and the tobacco plantations where the tobacco is no longer being cultivated due to the soil just being eroded and completely extracted of minerals. But what we will see in the early 1800s is the growth of cotton plantations across the South and Southwest. So free Black women that were in the South were also not included in the notions of kind of women's new civic duties. So that would apply to the North as well. Republican motherhood and education didn't exist in the same way that it did for white women. There was limited schools for Black women. And the last limitation that we see is just a greater or an expansion of gender construction. This idea that women are now responsible for populating the new nation really is attached to their biological ability to procreate and grow a child. So motherhood and marriage really gets amplified and more convoluted in what it means to be a woman. And for women that did not marry, that did not have children or couldn't have children, they are looked down upon because of it, because they're not, quote unquote, good Republican women for sort of growing this new nation. So that sums up sort of the opportunities and persistent limitations. And again, this is just a simple overview of women in the American Revolution. I really wanted to just draw on some of the main summative points for you. Hope it was helpful.